The storm came up off the lake like something with teeth, and Abraham Maddox had just enough time to think that he was about to lose his prize before he lost his life instead. He had been running for the better part of an hour, boots skidding on wet stone, the black pines whipping rain into his eyes, when he finally cornered her against the ravine above Greywater Landing. She stood with her back to 50 feet of empty air and a swollen creek below, a curved orc blade in each hand, chest heaving, green-gray skin slicked dark with rain. And she looked at him the way a cornered wolf looks at a man who has finally caught up to it, not with fear, but with the terrible calm of something deciding exactly how many of its enemies it intends to take with it. "Come no closer, huntsman," she said, and her voice was low and rough as river stone, though there was something underneath it that was not quite steady. "I have killed 6 of your lord's dogs already today. I do not tire of it." Abraham lowered his bow. He had drawn it on instinct, the way he drew it on stag and boar, but he had not loosed, and looking at her now soaked, cornered, alone, with old blood crusted along one tusk and a wound at her side that she was trying very hard not to favor, he found he could not imagine loosing it at all. "I'm not one of the hunt party," he said. "Not anymore. You wear their colors." Her amber eyes flicked to the green sash at his shoulder, the sigil of House Vane stitched crooked because he'd never bothered to have it properly fitted. "I wear my lord's colors because I'm his huntsman, and it's easier not to be shot by his own men when I'm wearing them. But I didn't come to bring you back in chains, ma'am. I came because I was the only one of that hunting party who could actually track a straight line through this rain, and I got here first." He nodded past her, down toward the tree line where distant shapes moved with torches and horns, the rest of the party still a quarter-mile behind, slowed by the mud. "They'll be along shortly, though, and they won't ask you nicely to put those down." Something in her face shifted, not trust, not yet, but a recalculation. She did not lower the blades. "Then you should step aside, human. I have no wish to kill the one man in this hunt who does not deserve it. Can't do that either." "Why not?" "Because there's a storm coming in off that lake that's going to kill us both a lot faster than any of Lord Vane's men will, and there's a shelter half a mile that way that I built with my own hands 2 winters back, and I'm not about to let a fool woman bleed out on a cliff edge rather than take the hand I'm offering her." He held out that hand, palm up, empty, rain running down his wrist. "I'm not your enemy. I'm not your friend either, not yet. But I'd rather you lived long enough to decide which one I am." Thunder cracked somewhere over the black water below, close enough that the ground seemed to flinch with it, and in the flash of lightning that followed, Abraham saw her properly for the first time, the fitted leather of her warrior's harness, dark and oiled and stitched tight along a figure built for war and somehow, impossibly, still beautiful in the wreck of it. The twin braids of black hair plastered to a jaw set hard against pain, the tusks that curved neat and short from a mouth that looked, in that unguarded instant, like it had forgotten how to do anything but grieve. "My name is Murak Steeljaw," she said finally, as if she had decided that if she was going to die on this cliff, someone should know it. "Widow of Curral Steeljaw, chieftain of the Ashfin clan, and I did not ask for a human's pity." "Good," Abraham said, "because I'm not offering any. I'm offering a roof and a fire before that storm turns this whole ravine into a river. That's a huntsman's courtesy, not pity. Take it or don't, but decide fast, because I am not standing out here much longer arguing with a woman about to fall off a cliff on principle." For one long moment she only stared at him, blade still raised, rain sluicing down the steel. Then somewhere below them a horn sounded closer now, and whatever calculation had been running behind those amber eyes resolved itself all at once. She lowered the blades. "Lead then, huntsman," she said, "but know that if this is a trap I will make certain you do not live to see the spring." "Fair enough," Abraham said, and turned and prayed to every god he half believed in that she would follow. She did. They ran. The storm shelter was a squat stone hut half sunk into the hillside above the lake, built by fishermen generations back for exactly this kind of weather, its door low and iron-banded. its single room smelling of moss and old smoke. Abraham had used it a dozen times over the years when the sky turned on him mid-hunt, had stocked it, quietly and without asking anyone's leave, with dry wood and a few furs and a tin of flint. He shouldered the door open now, and all but shoved Murak through ahead of him, following a heartbeat later as the first real fury of the storm broke loose behind them, rain turning to a hammering, roaring wall of water, the wind screaming down off the lake like something wounded. Inside, in the sudden close dark, Murak sagged for just a moment against the stone wall, one hand pressed to the wound at her side, before she caught herself and straightened, refusing, apparently on principle, to look weak in front of him. Abraham didn't comment on it. He busied himself instead with the door, dropping the iron bar across it, and then with the wood stacked in the corner, striking flint until a small fire caught and steadied in the pit at the center of the room. Only then did he turn to the fur bundled near the door, an old gray wool blanket, thick and dry, that he kept there for exactly such nights, and hold it out to her. "Here," he said, "you're soaked through. Wrap up before you catch your death, though I suppose that's a strange thing to worry about given the day you've had." Murak looked at the blanket, looked at him. Something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "You would give me your only blanket," she said, "and sit there yourself, cold and wet, playing the noble huntsman. Something like that." "No." She shook her head, water flying from the ends of her braids, and instead of taking the blanket she moved, favoring her side, but moving all the same to the fire pit and knelt, and began with quick, sure hands to feed it more carefully than he had, coaxing it up from a struggling flame into something that threw real heat into the small stone room. Then she looked up at him, over the fire, and patted the packed earth floor beside her. "Sit," she said. An orc does not hoard her fire while a man freezes at her side out of foolish pride. "Keep your blanket, huntsman. I would rather share warmth I built myself than wear a gift I did not earn." He hesitated. It was such a small thing, a woman offering him a place by her own fire, and yet it landed in his chest like something far larger, something he did not have a ready name for. "Abraham," he said. "My name's Abraham Maddox. If we're to sit by the same fire, you ought to at least know what to call the fool sitting in it." "Abraham," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and then, without further ceremony, reached out, caught the front of his rain-soaked jerkin, and hauled him down to sit beside her with a strength that startled a short laugh out of him even through the ache in his ribs from the day's running. "There," Murak said, satisfied, releasing him. "Now we are both warm and both foolish, and the storm may do as it likes outside." Outside, it did exactly that, the wind tearing at the door, the rain coming in sheets that hissed against the stone, thunder rolling long and low over the black water of the lake. But inside the shelter between them, the fire burned steady, and for the first time since he had crested the ravine and found her standing there with blood on her tusks and death in her eyes, Abraham Maddox felt something in his chest unclench that he had not even known was clenched. They sat like that a long while, not speaking, the fire popping softly between them, before Murak finally broke the silence, her eyes on the flames rather than on him. "You wish to know why the whole of your lord's household is hunting one widow through the rain," she said. It was not a question. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious." She was quiet another moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flatter, harder, the voice of someone reciting a wound rather than feeling it fresh. "My husband was chieftain of the Ashvin clan, on the far side of the ridge country. 3 months passed. The warlord Grosk came against us with twice our number, seeking to fold our lands and our people into his own. Kuril died holding the pass so our clan could scatter. I killed 11 of Grosk's warriors before they drove me from the field, and I have been running since first from Grosk, who wants me delivered to him as a trophy to prove his conquest complete, and now, it seems, from your Lord Vane, who has decided that handing a broken chieftain's widow over to a hungry warlord is a fine way to buy peace on his own borders." She looked up at him then, and there was no plea in her eyes, only a flat, terrible honesty. I am the prize in your lord's hunt, huntsman. The whole of that party chasing me through the rain tonight does not care whether I live or die. They care only who delivers me bound to Grosk's camp and what gold and favor that man is promised in return. Abraham sat with that for a long moment, feeling something cold settle where the fire's warmth had been. That's not a hunt, he said finally. That's a sale. Is there a difference to the deer? There is to the huntsman, he said, and meant it with a bitterness that surprised him. I've spent 11 years bringing meat to that man's table because it's honest work and I'm good at it. And not once in those 11 years has he asked me to run down a person and hand her over like she was a prize buck. I didn't sign on for that, and I'll be damned if I do it now that I've met you. Murak studied him across the fire, the light moving gold and orange over the sharp planes of her face, and something in her posture eased just slightly, not trust, not yet, but the first loosening of a guard held far too long. You are either very brave, she said, or very foolish to say such things to the very woman your lord sent you to catch. Maybe both, Abraham admitted. Wouldn't be the first time. Outside, the storm raged on, but between them, for the length of that long, strange night, an odd and fragile peace held two strangers, enemies by the letter of the hunt, sharing one small fire in a stone shelter while the world tried to tear itself apart around them, and neither one of them, in the end, moved an inch away from the other before the light finally broke gray and wet over the lake at dawn. They did not sleep, exactly. Not with the hunt still out there somewhere in the dark, not with the storm howling, but somewhere near the deep middle of the night. Murak's head had tipped, slow and unguarded, until it rested against Abraham's shoulder, and he had sat very still, hardly breathing, unwilling to be the one who broke whatever fragile thing was happening, until the fire burned down to embers and the wind outside finally began, at long last, to ease. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle and gray light crept under the door, they had made a decision without ever quite discussing it aloud. Abraham was not taking her back to Lord Vane, and Murak was not running, at least not yet, not alone. There's a cabin, he told her, as they doused the last of the fire and ready to move before the hunt party could pick up their trail again. Mine. Deep in the wood, a fair walk from the village, further still from the keep. No one goes there but me. You could rest there a few days, mend that wound properly, decide what comes next. Murak eyed him with the same measuring look she'd given him on the cliff. And what do you gain from hiding your lord's prize in your own home, Abraham Maddox? He considered the question honestly because he owed her that much. I don't rightly know yet, he admitted. Maybe nothing but trouble, but I know what I don't want, and that's to spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to do right by somebody and didn't take it because it was easier not to. He shrugged, suddenly a little embarrassed by his own earnestness. Besides, you make good company by a fire. That's worth something too. Something that might, in a kinder light, have been called a smile touched the corner of Murak's mouth. Lead on then, huntsman, she said. Again. And again, she followed. The cabin sat in a hollow 2 miles from the nearest deer trail, low-roofed and sturdy, built of the same dark timber as the woods around it. With a stone chimney Abraham had laid himself stone by stone the summer he turned 23. It was a small place, 1 room and a loft, smelling of tallow and cured hides and the dried herbs he strung along the rafters, but it was dry and it was hidden. And for the first 3 days Murak Steeljaw occupied it like a wounded animal takes a den, sleeping in short, wary bursts, one hand never far from a blade, watching the door far more than she watched him. Abraham let her. He tended the wound at her side with the same rough competence he brought to setting a snare or dressing a deer, no fuss. No lingering touches he hadn't earned, boiling water and clean linen and a salve of yarrow. He kept for his own hunting scrapes, and otherwise he simply went about the business of his days, checking trap lines, splitting wood, cooking whatever the woods gave up, as if having an orc widow recovering on his own cot were the most ordinary thing in the world. It was on the 4th day, when he came back from the trap lines with 2 rabbits and found her outside splitting his firewood, not because he'd asked, but because, as she informed him with a look that dared him to object. She had grown tired of lying still like a broken thing. That something between them shifted from wary cohabitation into something else. "You're going to reopen that wound," he said, setting down the rabbits, watching her swing the axe with a strength that sent the logs apart in single clean strokes. "I have taken worse wounds hunting boar than the one your lord's man gave me," Murex said, not even breaking rhythm. "I will not lie in a human's bed like an invalid while he does all the work of keeping us both fed. It's not a competition." "Everything is a competition, Abraham Maddox." She set the axe down at last, breathing a little hard, and turned to face him, and there was something almost teasing in the set of her mouth now, a lightness he had not yet seen in her. "You should know that about orc women before you get too comfortable sharing your fire with one." Duly noted. He found himself grinning back at her, an easy, unguarded thing that surprised him with how natural it felt. "Anything else I should know?" She considered this with mock seriousness, hands on her hips, rain-dampened hair loose now around her shoulders since she'd stopped bothering with the tight braids of a warrior on the march. "That we do not think easily, and we do not forget easily either. Both are true of me. You have given me shelter twice now, huntsman. I do not know yet what that is worth, but I do not intend to forget it. I wasn't looking to be repaid." "I know," Murex said, quieter now, some of the teasing gone out of her voice, replaced by something more careful. "That is precisely why I intend to repay it anyway." They stood there a moment too long, the split logs forgotten between them, the afternoon light slanting gold through the pines, and Abraham felt the same unfamiliar tightness in his chest that he'd felt in the storm shelter, a wanting he hadn't asked for and didn't quite know what to do with. It was Murex who broke it, stepping back, gathering the split wood into her arms with brisk efficiency. "Your rabbits will spoil if you stand there gawking, huntsman." "Right," Abraham said, and went to see to supper, and did not examine too closely why his heart was beating like he'd run the whole ravine again. Over the following 2 weeks, that pattern held and deepened, small domestic rhythms building between them, charged in ways neither of them named aloud. She healed. She grew restless with healing, and restless in turn made her sharp-tongued and teasing, needling him about his cooking, his aim, the state of his boots, until he found himself needling her right back, and their evenings by the hearth turned from wary silence into long, easy conversation that ran late into the night. He learned things about her in pieces, that she had been a warrior in her own right long before she was ever a chieftain's wife, that she and Curel had been matched not by arrangement but by her own choosing, at a summer gathering years back, when she had bested him in a wrestling match and he had laughed instead of sulking. And she had decided then, and there, that any man who could laugh at losing to a woman was worth a second look. She spoke of him carefully, in the way of someone still learning how to hold grief without it cutting her hands, and Abraham never pushed, only listened, and that listening, more than anything else he did, seemed to be what finally began to soften something guarded in her. She learned things about him too, that he had come to be the Lord's huntsman almost by accident, a boy good with a bow who needed steady work and found he preferred the deep woods to any hall or hearth full of people, that he had no family left to speak of, and had made a kind of peace with that, that he answered to Lord Vane only so far as the man's borders required it, and to no one at all once he crossed the tree line. "You are a strange man," Murex told him one night. The fire between them burned down to coals, both of them sprawled comfortably close on the furs before the hearth in a way that had become, without either of them remarking on it, simply how they sat now. "A huntsman who answers to no one, a man alone by choice who nonetheless took in a stranger and an enemy of his own lord without a second thought." "You weren't an enemy," Abraham said. "You were a woman in trouble. Those are different things." "Not to your Lord Vane. No," he admitted, "not to him, but I don't much care what he thinks if I'm honest, and haven't for a long while." Murex was quiet a moment, watching the coals. "That will change," she said, "when he learns you have hidden me under his own nose for 2 weeks. Men like your Lord Vane do not forgive being made fools of." Let him try to make something of it then, Abraham said, with more bravado than he entirely felt, and Murak looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, something warm and something worried both at once. You should not speak so lightly of it, she said. I have already cost one man his life for standing against those who wanted me delivered like cargo. I would not have that be true of two. Curel, Abraham said gently, the first time either of them had spoken his name aloud since that first night. Curel, she agreed, and did not say more, and he did not ask her to. It was 3 days later that the need for supplies finally forced them both toward the village, and it was there, on the docks of Greywater Landing, that everything that had been quietly building between them finally found its first real test. Greywater Landing sat along the shallow northern curve of the lake, a scatter of wooden docks and low stone and timber houses climbing the hillside above the water, smoke rising from chimneys, fishing boats bobbing at their moorings, the whole place smelling of tar and fish and wood smoke. Abraham came here every few weeks to trade furs and game for flour, salt, oil, the small necessities a huntsman's cabin couldn't provide on its own, and he had intended, this time, to leave Murak safely hidden at the tree line while he did his business quickly and came straight back. He had not accounted for the storm. It came up fast and mean off the open water, the kind of squall the lake folk feared more than any winter blizzard, because it gave almost no warning, a darkening on the horizon, a shift in the wind, and then it was on them, whitecaps rising fast and violent, 3 fishing boats still out on the water when the first hard gust hit, sails and nets whipping, men shouting from the docks as the boats pitched wildly against waves that had been flat calm not 20 minutes before. Abraham was halfway through loading a sack of flour onto his pack horse when the shouting started, and he turned in time to see the nearest boat roll hard, dumping 2 men into the churning gray water, the current already dragging them out past where any rope thrown from the dock could reach. He was already moving, kicking off his boots, when a hand closed hard on his arm and stopped him cold. You cannot swim that current, huntsman, Murak said. She had come down from the tree line at the first sound of trouble, storm or no storm, discovery or no discovery, and stood now at the dock's edge with the wind whipping her braids loose, her eyes fixed on the drowning men. You will die trying and save no one. I can't just stand here and watch them drown. No, she agreed, and before he could say another word she had stripped off her heavy cloak, kicked free of her boots, and dove from the end of the dock in one clean, powerful motion that sent a gasp rippling through the small crowd of villagers now gathering along the shore. She swam like something built for it, cutting through the churning water with a strength no ordinary man could have matched, reaching the first drowning fisherman just as his head went under, and hauling him up by the collar with one arm while she kicked hard against the current with the other. A second trip brought the other man in, and by the time she dragged herself and both fishermen up onto the dock, coughing, soaked, her leather harness clinging to her like a second skin, the entire village had gathered to watch, and the mood among them was a complicated, roiling thing relief for the rescued men, and something far warier, far more frightened, directed at the orc woman who had just saved them. That's a Steeljaw warrior, someone muttered from the crowd, an old fisherman, gray-bearded, staring at the tattooed sigil visible now at her collarbone where her harness had slipped in the water. I've seen that mark before on raiders. She just saved Tam and Wick's lives, Abraham said, sharp and immediate, stepping between the crowd and Murak before the muttering could gather any more weight. I don't much care what mark she wears. She dove into that water when the rest of us were still finding our boots. The crowd did not disperse easily. Orcs were still, to most of these lake folk, creatures out of old war stories, raiders and reavers, and the sight of one standing dripping on their dock, however heroic the act that had put her there, unsettled something old and stubborn in them. But no one moved against her either, not with the 2 rescued fishermen still gasping their thanks at her feet, and slowly, grudgingly, The crowd's fear curdled into something more like uneasy respect. That night back at the cabin, Murak sat wrapped in a dry blanket by the fire, wringing water from her braids, and Abraham found himself unable to look away from her, not from desire alone, though that was there too, warm and insistent under his ribs, but from something larger, a kind of wonder at the whole shape of her, the courage of her, the way she had thrown herself without hesitation into danger for strangers who feared her. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "No," Murak agreed, "but I did it anyway. Does that surprise you?" "Nothing about you surprises me anymore," Abraham said, and it came out rougher, more honest than he'd intended, and Murak's eyes came up to his, steady and searching in the firelight. "That is a dangerous thing to say to me, huntsman," she said softly. "Maybe I don't care about dangerous anymore either." The space between them on the furs had narrowed without either of them quite noticing when, and now Murak reached out, slow and deliberate, and laid one hand against the side of his jaw, her thumb tracing rough and careful along his cheekbone, and Abraham went very still, hardly breathing as she studied his face like she was memorizing it. "An orc does not do this lightly," she murmured. "Does not touch a man's face like this unless she means something by it." "What do you mean by it?" "I do not know yet," she admitted, and there was real vulnerability in it, a crack in all that fierce composure. "I have not wanted to know a man since Curel died." "I did not expect to want to know a human at all." "I'm not asking you to know anything you're not ready for," Abraham said, though every part of him wanted to close that last small distance between them. "I just want you safe. Whatever else comes after that, we'll figure it out." "You keep saying things like that," Murak said, "as if it costs you nothing to be so kind." "Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I just haven't had much reason to be kind to anybody in a long time, and it turns out I like having one." Something in her face broke open then, soft and unguarded in a way he had not yet seen from her, and she closed the last of the distance herself, pressing her mouth to his, not gentle, not tentative, but with the same fierce certainty she brought to everything else, one hand fisted in the front of his shirt as if she meant to make sure he could not pull away even if some foolish part of him wanted to. He didn't want to. He kissed her back with everything he had, months of loneliness and years of quiet, unexamined want finally finding somewhere to go. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Murak rested her forehead against his and let out a low, rough laugh. "There," she said, "now we have both been foolish twice. I could stand to be a fool a few more times if you're offering." "I am not offering," Murak said, tugging him back toward her by the front of his shirt. "I am claiming, huntsman. There is a difference among my people. You should learn it if you mean to keep sitting by my fire." "Teach me then," Abraham said, and she did in her own way, for the rest of that long, warm night, not with words, but with the slow, deliberate unmaking of every careful distance either of them had kept between them until then. And when dawn came, gray and soft through the cabin's single window, they lay tangled together in the furs before the banked coals, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily say, neither one felt alone. The weeks that followed were, against every reasonable expectation, some of the happiest either of them had known. Murak's wound healed fully. She grew strong again, restless in the good way, taking to hunting alongside Abraham through the deep wood with a skill that put even his practiced eye to shame, and their evenings settled into an easy, teasing rhythm of shared meals and shared warmth that neither one seemed inclined to question too closely, as if by not naming what they had become they could keep it safe from the wider world's notice a little longer. That, of course, could not last. It was Murak herself who forced the reckoning, insisting they return to the village every so often, not out of recklessness, but because, as she told him plainly one evening, she would not spend the rest of her days hiding in a cabin like something ashamed of itself. "I did not run from Grosk's warband to become a woman who fears her own shadow," she said. "I would rather face whatever comes than live small, Abraham, even for you." He understood that, even as it frightened him, and so they went back to Greywater Landing together, openly, and slowly, over several more visits, something shifted in the village's wary regard of her. She mended a fisherman's torn net with quick fingers and no fee asked. She hauled a wagon free of the mud that had swallowed its wheel to the axle, alone, while 3 men stood arguing about how best to organize a team to do it. She sat with the old healer woman of the village, Greta, comparing herb lore late into an afternoon, and left the old woman shaking her head in something like admiration. Bit by bit, grudgingly, unevenly, Greywater Landing began to see Murak Steeljaw not as a raider's ghost, but as a woman who had, more than once now, put herself between their village and harm. It was into this fragile, hard-won peace that Lord Vane's men rode, 6 weeks after the storm that had first brought Abraham and Murak together, and shattered it in the space of a single terrible afternoon. Abraham was at the tannery when he heard the horses, and his stomach dropped before he even turned to look, some old huntsman's instinct recognizing the rhythm of soldiers riding with purpose rather than patrol. By the time he reached the square, it was already too late to stop what was happening. A dozen of Lord Vane's household guard, in the man's own green livery, had Murak surrounded near the well, blades drawn, and at their head sat a man Abraham recognized with a sick lurch. Captain Roswell Pike, the same officer who had led the original hunt through the storm-lashed woods 6 weeks before, and who clearly had not forgotten the huntsman who'd vanished with his quarry that night. "There she is," Pike called out, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, his horse sidestepping nervously as Murak stood her ground, hand on the hilt of the blade she still, out of long habit, never went without. The widow Steeljaw, prize of Lord Vane's hunt, hidden 6 weeks under our own noses by a huntsman who ought to have known better than to betray his lord's household for an orc's bed. The crowd's murmur turned ugly fast, old fears resurfacing under the weight of the accusation, and Abraham shoved through them toward the well, heart hammering. "She's done nothing to your village but help it," he shouted. "Pulled 2 men from the lake with her own hands, mended nets, cleared roads. You want to talk about betrayal, Pike? You talk about handing a widow over to the man who slaughtered her clan. That is not your concern, huntsman," Pike said coldly. "Lord Vane's treaty with warlord Grosk is signed. The widow is the price of peace on this border, and you have interfered with your lord's business for the last time. Bind her." 2 soldiers moved forward. Murak's blade came free of its sheath in a single fluid motion, and for one terrible moment it looked as though the square would become a slaughter, until Abraham threw himself bodily between her and the advancing soldiers, arms spread, unarmed. "You'll have to go through me," he said, and his voice, to his own surprise, did not shake. "That can be arranged," Pike said and gestured, and 3 soldiers seized Abraham from behind before he could react, wrenching his arms back, while 4 more closed on Murak. She fought fiercely, viciously, dropping 1 soldier with a broken wrist and another with a boot to the ribs, but numbers and steel eventually told, and within a few brutal minutes both of them were bound, kneeling in the dirt of the square while the whole village looked on in horrified silence. "Take them to the keep," Pike ordered. "Lord Vane will decide what's to be done with a huntsman who thinks his own wants outweigh his lord's treaties." They were dragged the 3 miles to Vanehold bound and on foot, and thrown into the damp stone cells beneath the keep to await Lord Vane's judgment, and it was there in the dark, with the cold seeping up through the flagstones, that Murak finally allowed herself, for the first time since Abraham had met her, to sound afraid. "He will give me to Grosk regardless of what happens to you," she said quietly, through the bars separating their 2 small cells. "That was always the plan. I am the peace price. Nothing that happens here changes that math for your lord." "It changes it for me," Abraham said. "I'm not letting that happen, Murak. You are chained in a cell, Abraham." Her voice cracked just slightly on his name. "There is very little you can do about anything from here." "Then I'll do it from wherever I end up next," he said, with more certainty than he felt, and reached through the bars until he found her hand in the dark and held it, and did not let go for a long, long time. Lord Vane's judgment, when it came 2 days later, came in the worst possible way. Publicly, at midday, in the square of Greywater Landing itself, where the Lord had ridden down from his keep specifically, so the lake folk could witness what became of those who defied him. They dragged Murak up onto a raised wooden platform at the center of the square, hands bound, and forced her to her knees before a wooden block, while a headsman in Lord Vane's colors stood ready with a broad axe, and the crowd, the same villagers whose lives she had saved, whose nets she had mended, whose roads she had cleared, gathered in a wide, frightened, silent ring around the platform, unwilling to look away and unable, it seemed, to intervene. Lord Vane himself sat mounted at the square's edge, a soft-faced man in fine wool with cold, calculating eyes, flanked by Captain Pike and a dozen more soldiers. Abraham, still bound, was held kneeling near the platform steps, forced to watch, and every part of him screamed to move, to fight, to do something, anything, and found only rope and steel in answer. "Let this stand as example," Lord Vane announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying flat and cold across the square, "of what becomes of enemies of this border who are harbored rather than delivered. The Orc widow Steeljaw is forfeit under the terms of my treaty with warlord Grosk. Since she cannot be delivered whole after the trouble she has caused, she will instead be delivered as proof of good faith another way." The headsman raised the axe. "Stop." The word tore out of Abraham before he'd even fully decided to say it, and he lunged forward against his bonds with a strength born of pure desperation, throwing his whole weight against the soldier holding him, until the man staggered, and Abraham broke free, scrambling up the platform steps on his knees, throwing himself bodily across Murak's kneeling form between her and the raised axe, close enough that he felt the headsman's hesitation ripple through the crowd like a held breath. "You'll have to take my head with hers," Abraham shouted up at Lord Vane, "because I'm not moving, and if you kill her, you kill me first, and every soul in this village who's seen what she's done for them these past weeks will know exactly what kind of lord orders that." The crowd, which had stood silent through the whole terrible ceremony, suddenly found its voice, a rising murmur, then a shout, then a dozen shouts, villagers pushing forward against the soldier's line. "She pulled Tam and Wick out of the lake," the old gray-bearded fisherman bellowed, shoving toward the platform. "Nearly killed herself doing it. You'd murder the woman who saved my son. She mended half the nets in this village for no coin," a woman cried. "She's more used to this town than any soldier you've sent us, my lord." Lord Vane's composure cracked for the first time, his cold eyes darting across a crowd that had, in the space of a few heartbeats, turned decisively against him. Captain Pike shifted uneasily in his saddle, one hand drifting to his sword hilt, clearly unsure whether the greater danger now lay with the bound Orc widow or with his own lord's rapidly souring subjects. "This is treason," Lord Vane snapped, though his voice had lost its earlier flat certainty. "The huntsman defies my direct order." "Your direct order is to hand an innocent widow over to the man who murdered her whole clan, to buy yourself a peace that costs you nothing and her everything," Abraham shouted back, still shielding Murak with his own body, close enough now that he could feel her shaking beneath him, not with fear, he realized, but with fury held on the thinnest possible leash. "You call that justice? Every soul in this square knows better, my lord, and so do you." For one long, suspended moment, nothing moved, the headsman frozen with the axe still raised, the crowd surging but not yet breaking, Lord Vane's face working through some private calculation of cost and consequence. And then into that terrible silence, a new voice cut through, low and rough and absolutely furious. "Enough!" It was Murak. She had, in the chaos, worked one hand free of its bindings. The rope frayed, Abraham realized with a jolt, from the earlier struggle in the square days before, weakened just enough that a warrior's strength and a warrior's patience had finally torn it loose. And now she surged up from her knees, dragging Abraham with her, and turned to face Lord Vane directly, her voice carrying clear and hard across the whole silent square. "You would trade my life for a warlord's favor, human lord, as if I were cattle to be sold at market, she said. But hear this, and hear it well. Grosk did not defeat the Ashvin clan through strength alone. He defeated us through treachery, through allies who sold us out for exactly the kind of coin you are so eager to collect now. If you deliver me to him, you do not buy peace. You buy his contempt and his certainty that this border is soft enough to walk through whenever he pleases next. I am not a peace price, my lord. I am a warning of exactly what kind of ally you would be trading for. The square held its breath. Lord Vane's jaw worked, his eyes flicking from Murak's unbowed fury to the restless, muttering crowd at his back, to Captain Pike's uncertain face, and Abraham watched the man's cold calculation finally, visibly, tip. "Cut them loose," Lord Vane said at last, the words coming out clipped and bitter, a man choosing the lesser of two humiliations. "I'll not have this village turn on its own lord over one orc widow. The treaty with Grosk is void. Let him come collect his own peace if he wants it so badly." Captain Pike, after a moment's visible relief, drew his own dagger and stepped forward, cutting the remaining ropes at Abraham's wrists with quick, businesslike strokes, and then, at a sharp look from his lord, did the same for Murak, though he could not quite meet her eyes as he did it. The crowd's tension broke all at once into a ragged, disbelieving cheer, and Abraham, still half-braced for some final cruelty, found himself instead pulled bodily against Murak's chest as she wrapped both freed arms around him and simply held on, shaking now with something that was no longer fury but pure, overwhelming relief. "You are the greatest fool I have ever met," she said against his hair, half a sob and half a laugh. "Throwing yourself across an axe block for me." "Wasn't going to let you go through that alone," Abraham said, muffled against her shoulder, his own voice not entirely steady either. "Told you back in that storm shelter. I don't hand people over. Not to a hunt, not to an axe, not to anybody." "No," Murak agreed, pulling back just far enough to look at him properly, her thumb brushing rough and gentle along his jaw the same way it had that first night by the fire. "You do not. I am beginning to understand that about you, huntsman." Lord Vane, sour-faced and clearly eager to be gone from a square that had so thoroughly humiliated him, wheeled his horse and rode for the keep road without another word, Captain Pike and the soldiers falling in behind him, and the crowd parted to let them go with a silence that spoke louder than any jeering could have. It was the old fisherman, gray-bearded Wick's father, who broke that silence at last, stepping up onto the platform's lowest step and clasping Murak's forearm in the rough, direct greeting of lake folk. "You'll always have a place at my table, Widow Steeljaw," he said gruffly. "Axe or no axe, treaty or no treaty. That's not nothing, coming from a man who used to bar his door at the mention of your kind." "It is not nothing at all," Murak said, and something in her voice, thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show, told Abraham exactly how much that small, gruff kindness meant to a woman who had spent months running, alone, from a world that mostly wanted her dead or delivered. But the danger was not entirely finished. Not yet, because word of avoided treaty travels faster than a soldier can ride, and it was less than a week later, on a gray, still morning with mist still clinging low over the lake, that Abraham woke to the sound of Murak already up, standing tense at the cabin's single window, watching the tree line with the flat, focused stillness of a warrior who has heard something the rest of the world has not yet noticed. "Riders," she said quietly before he could even ask. "Orc riders, Grosk's colors, unless I am very much mistaken, perhaps a dozen." Abraham was up and reaching for his bow before she finished speaking. "He's come to collect his prize himself, then, since Vane wouldn't deliver her." "He has come to punish an insult," Murak corrected grimly, already checking the edge of her blade. "Grosk does not forgive being denied what he believes owed to him. This will not end with words, Abraham." They met the riders not at the cabin, which Abraham refused to let become a battlefield, but out along the ridge trail above the lake. In open ground where a dozen mounted orc warriors in Grosk's black and red colors sat waiting, led by a broad, scarred orc on a heavy warhorse whose bearing radiated the particular, casual cruelty of a man used to taking what he wanted without consequence. "Widow Steeljaw," Grosk said, his voice carrying easy amusement across the open ground, as if the whole confrontation were beneath his notice. "I had thought Lord Vane a coward for failing to deliver you as promised, but I see now the truth is stranger. You have taken up with a human dog instead of your own kind's mourning. Curel would be ashamed." "Curel is dead because of you," Murex said, voice flat and lethal. "And he would be far more ashamed to see me kneel to the man who orphaned our whole clan for the sake of your own vanity, Grosk. I will not be delivered. Not to Vane, not to you, not to anyone. If you have come for a prize, you have wasted a ride." Grosk's amusement flickered just slightly into something colder. "Then I will take you as a trophy of a different kind," he said and gestured, and his riders began, unhurried, to spread out along the ridge, clearly intending to encircle rather than charge, the kind of patient, methodical violence of men who have done this before and expect no real resistance. Abraham stepped his horse forward, drawing level with Murak's shoulder, bow already knocked, and raised his voice to carry across the whole ridge. "There are a dozen of you," he called out, "and every man of you knows the woman standing beside me killed 11 of your warband alone at the pass 3 months back, wounded and outnumbered. You want to test whether she's grown weaker since then, or whether she simply had time to grow angrier. I know which I'd bet on." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the mounted riders. Abraham could see it. The way men's eyes flicked sideways toward each other rather than forward toward their enemy. The particular hesitation of soldiers who have heard stories about the woman in front of them, and are only now realizing those stories might be entirely true. It was into that hesitation that a new sound broke: hoofbeats, many of them, coming up fast along the ridge trail from the direction of the village. And Abraham turned to see, with a jolt of disbelieving relief, a ragged column of Greywater Landing's own folk riding and running up the slope behind them. The gray-bearded fisherman on a borrowed cart horse, a dozen village men armed with fishing spears and wood axes, even old Greta the healer striding along with a heavy walking staff gripped like a weapon, and at their head, astonishingly, Captain Pike himself, still in Lord Vane's colors, sword drawn. "Lord Vane may be a coward," Pike called out as they crested the ridge, "but I am not about to stand by and watch a warband ride into our own border country unchallenged, treaty or no treaty. This is Vane land, Grosk, and you'll answer to more than one widow and one huntsman if you mean to take it by force." Grosk's gaze swept the growing line of villagers and soldiers now arrayed along the ridge, weighing numbers against the certain cost of a fight he had clearly expected to be far easier, and after a long, tense moment, his lip curled in something between contempt and grudging retreat. "Keep your widow, then, huntsman," he spat, wheeling his horse. "She is more trouble than any trophy is worth, but know that the Ashvin name dies with her, alone in some human's cabin, and that is a fitting enough end for a chieftain's line that could not hold its own pass." "The Ashvin name," Murek called after him, cold and clear, "will outlive you regardless, Grosk, because I intend to live a very long time simply to spite you." The warband rode off down the far slope of the ridge without another word, and the village line let out a rough, exhausted cheer, and Abraham finally let his bow arm drop, his whole body flooding with a shaking relief he hadn't let himself feel until the danger was fully past. Murak turned to him, breathing hard, eyes bright, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the space of a few feet, the whole ridge and the lake beyond it and the gray morning sky all falling away into something that felt suddenly very small compared to the simple fact of both of them still standing. "You brought a village to my defense," she said softly. "I didn't bring anybody," Abraham said. "They came on their own, same as you saved them at those docks without being asked." Seems like that's the kind of debt that doesn't ask to be repaid the way you keep thinking it does. It just gets paid forward when it's needed. Murak crossed the last of the distance between them and kissed him there on the open ridge, in front of villagers and soldiers alike, without a single moment's hesitation. And the small cheer that went up from the gathered crowd this time had nothing to do with battles won and everything to do with two people who had clearly, finally, stopped pretending they weren't exactly where they wanted to be. That evening, back at the cabin, with the lake gone silver and still under a clear sky for the first time in what felt like months, Murak built the fire herself, as she always did now, and settled beside it, and drew Abraham down against her with the same unceremonious certainty she'd shown that very first night in the storm shelter. "There is a custom among my people," she said quietly, watching the flames rather than him, "older than clans, older than chieftains. To share one's fire with another freely without being asked is to offer them a claim on your life. I did not think of it that first night in the storm shelter. I was cold and wounded, and I did not want to sit alone while a fool huntsman froze beside me out of misplaced courtesy." She paused, "But I have thought of it many times since, and I do not think, if I am honest, that it was so unthinking a thing as I told myself at the time." Abraham turned his head against her shoulder to look up at her. "Are you telling me you claimed me before you even liked me?" "I am telling you," Murak said, with the particular dry precision she used when she was, in fact, revealing something that cost her a great deal to say aloud, "that some part of me knew that very first night, watching you offer me a blanket you clearly needed more than I did, that I had found something I did not want to let go of, even if the rest of me spent weeks arguing otherwise." She looked down at him then, amber eyes soft in the firelight. "I am not a woman who claims lightly, Abraham Maddox. I claimed once before and buried what I claimed and told myself I would not do so again. But I find I have done it anyway. I find I am glad of it." "Good," Abraham said, reaching up to tangle his fingers with hers where they rested against his chest. "Because I claimed you back, somewhere around the second time you threatened to kill me and then decided not to. Didn't have a fancy custom for it. Just knew I wasn't letting you walk out of that storm shelter without finding some way to keep you close. You are a very poor huntsman, if that is the extent of your claiming customs." "I catch what I go after eventually," Abraham said. "Just took me a bit longer with you than with most game." Murak laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the sound of it filling the small cabin in a way that made something in Abraham's chest ache with how much he'd come, in just a few short months, to need exactly that sound in his life. They stayed on at the cabin through the rest of that autumn and into the turning of winter, no longer hiding, no longer wary of the village's notice, and Greywater Landing, having watched an orc widow bleed and fight and stand her ground for their sake more than once now, settled slowly and unevenly, but genuinely into treating her as something closer to one of their own than a stranger to be feared. Lord Vane, chastened by his own square's rebellion and wary of further embarrassment, made no further move against either of them, content to let the matter of a runaway prize and a defiant huntsman quietly disappear from his ledgers rather than risk another public humiliation. In the spring, when the ice finally broke on the lake and the docks filled again with the business of a new fishing season, Abraham and Murak stood together at the end of the same dock, where she had first dove into the storm-churned water to save two drowning men, watching the sun come up gold and clean over the water, and Murak turned to him with a question in her eyes that he had, by then, learned to read easily. "You are thinking of leaving the Lord's service," she said. It was not really a question. "Thought about it a lot this winter," Abraham admitted. "I answer to no one out in the deep wood, always have, and that's suited me fine my whole life. But it occurs to me now that there's a whole wide country past these woods I've never had a reason to see, and I find I've got a reason now." "And what reason is that?" "You," he said simply. "Wherever you want to go, Murak. I'd rather see the world at your side than spend the rest of my days bringing deer to a lord's table who tried to have you executed in his own square." Murak considered this, the lake wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, and then reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his with the same fierce certainty she brought to everything. There may be scattered Ashvan folk still in the far ridge country, she said. Survivors of that day at the pass who fled as I did. I do not know how many or where, but I find now that I would like to go looking for them. Not to rebuild a clan, perhaps. That may be beyond even me. But to know, at least, who still lives, and to tell them their chieftain's widow did not die running and did not die alone. Sounds like a good enough reason to leave a lake behind, Abraham said. I'll go where you're going, Murak Steeljaw, storm or no storm. She turned to him fully then, the morning light catching gold in her amber eyes, and there was no wariness left in her at all, none of the guarded distance of that first night on the cliff above the ravine, only a warmth so open and unguarded that it caught in Abraham's throat every time he was lucky enough to see it turn toward him. You offered me a blanket that first night, she said softly, as if warmth were something to be given away and not shared. I did not understand then what I was offering back, sharing my fire with you instead. I understand it now. I have understood it for some time. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, the same gesture she'd made 100 times since that first storm-lashed night, though it had never once lost its weight. You are my fire now, Abraham Maddox, as surely as I am yours. Wherever we go from this dock, we go carrying that with us. I would not have it any other way. Neither would I, Abraham said, and drew her in, and kissed her there in the clean spring light with the whole lake glittering behind them and the docks full of villagers who no longer looked twice at the sight of a human huntsman, and an orc widow standing wrapped in each other's arms, as if the world had always meant for them to end up exactly there. They left Greywater Landing 3 days later, packs loaded, the cabin shuttered but not abandoned. Abraham meant to come back to it. Someday, when the ridge country had given up whatever it had left to give them, and walked north together along the old trade road that climbed away from the lake and into the wider, wilder country beyond. Two figures growing small against the tree line, no longer hunted, no longer hiding, no longer alone. Behind them, the storm shelter above the ravine stood empty and quiet in the spring sun, its iron-banded door shut fast against whatever weather might come next, holding within its cool stone walls the memory of one small, stubborn fire that had, on a night neither of them would ever forget, warmed two strangers into something neither of them had dared to hope for, and had never once, in all the months since, gone entirely out.